Alrighty, let's jump in here. Okay, so I hope this thing even works. Really? All right. So, um, on Friday, we started talking about we finished talking about Bruce's um, secularization, late secularization, or religion as alien, and today we're going to really dig into Rodney Stark's secularization RIP, or RIP secularization, where he basically lays out his case for a view that I think you could fairly call no secularization or zero secularization. Okay, before I jump in, any questions anyone has before we get started? Grades should be posted for everybody. I finished marking on Sunday morning because I hate myself. And working 7 days a week is apparently something I do now. So that's super fun. Any questions at all? Okay, if you want to review it, please just make an appointment with me, and you can come to my office and we can take a look at it together. I don't open it up for review on eClass because that just leads to emails with 10 questions. It takes me forever. It's much quicker for me just to have a conversation with you about it. Okay, so if there are no questions, I don't even know if I have a question slide somewhere in here. No. All right, no questions. Perfect. I love no questions. Right. So, kind of as we said last time, Stark lays out this case basically, and takes a kind of victory lap in this piece because he's been arguing that the secularization theory as it stands is basically wrong, essentially since the 1960s, 1970s. And then in this piece, right, finally with Peter Berger's retraction of his kind of views of secularization in 1997, 1998, I can't remember which year, Stark kind of wants to make the case now that this theory should be, is dead, and can we please just bury it already? Its zombified corpse continues to haunt sociology, and we should really just put it away. Okay, so we ended off on this slide on Friday, and basically what's important here is that Stark is going to make what I think are a couple of really provocative claims in the piece, amongst which are basically that Europe. Okay, so the key piece of evidence, right, and this you see it in Steve Bruce's piece, right? The key piece of evidence, if you're going to find evidence that points to secularization, the key piece of evidence is going to be Western Europe, right? Because this idea that modernity and secularization have gone hand in hand really relies on, those most modern parts of the world becoming secularized, right? So as Europe entered into modernity, it became more secular. And so one of the tasks that Stark needs to accomplish, and it's for you to judge whether he's accomplished this, is to sort of look at Western Europe and say why Western Europe doesn't count as evidence of secularization, right? He has to make the case that there's another phenomenon going on. And basically he does this by saying, there has been no particular decline in religiosity in Europe, why religious participation was very low in Northern and Western Europe for centuries before modernization, right? And that levels of subjective religiosity remain relatively high. Okay. So step one in making this case is what Stark calls the myth of past piety, right? So basically what he says is that we have this image of Europe, right? We have this image of medieval Europe in particular as this place that was intensely religious. Basically medieval Europe, according to Stark, and I think this is the general image we have, that it was super Christian, right? Everybody was incredibly faithful, right? That everybody went to church, and that was the story of, that whole Middle Ages period, basically between 500 and 500 and 1550, that everybody was incredibly religious, right? So what Stark does then is he wants to say, actually, this conception that we have of Europe as this intensely religious place that then went through the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, and, as it went through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, it got less and less religious, right? As modernity came in, it became less and less religious until it hits the form that we see today in a very secular Europe. Okay, so now this is a somewhat difficult case to prove in some ways from a sociological perspective. Why? Well, because, for all of its many wonderful attributes, medieval society didn't keep statistics in a way that we would kind of understand them, right? They weren't doing censuses where they asked about people's, what is your religious faith? How often do you attend religious services? So we have to deal, in a sense, and what Stark does in the piece, and he's really good at this, and we'll see it again when we talk about the rise of Christianity, and then the book he writes with, is it with Bainbridge? I want to say it's with William Bainbridge, called The Churching of America. He goes through and kind of finds historical evidence that he then uses in a sociological way. And it's a methodology that all good sociologists probably hate because it's not statistical, right? And it's a little bit anecdotal, but there's lots to recommend it, right? I think it's kind of brilliant, and I like the way he kind of does it. Okay, so basically, he goes through a whole bunch of historical texts and pulls from them basically one salient fact that he thinks proves that the past was much less religious than we think it was, that there was a litany of Christian figures, scholars and religious figures in the Middle Ages complaining that nobody comes to church, right, in Europe, right? And this quote from Stark, right? As for the ordinary people during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, the masses rarely entered a church, and their private worship was directed towards an array of spirits and supernatural agencies, only some of them recognizably Christian, right? Okay, so what does this mean? Right, one of the things that Stark contends, and this I think is well backed up in history, is that in the Middle Ages, one of the things that continued was a lot of essentially worship of the old pagan gods of Greece and Rome, especially in the countryside, right? And the rural areas where it kind of continued. And there was a kind of a long lingering life of some of these pagan spirits. Now, some of them end up getting Christianized, right? Where Christianity, and you've probably heard, sort of anecdotally stories where, Christianity comes in and it, from German tradition, it takes the Christmas tree and Easter eggs and the chickens and bunnies at Easter, right? And then it sort of Christianized a lot of aspects of different forms of paganism, but at least in some forms, like some of these sort of remained in medieval society, right? And there's lots of evidence that some of these practices stayed for a really, really long time. He suggests that many priests could not even properly perform the Mass because they spoke no Latin, or spoke and understood no Latin. And this we know is true because when you get to, particularly after the Protestant Reformation, right? So October 31st, Halloween, 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg. And kicks off the Protestant Reformation. I see your question. I'll get to it in a sec. And then, what happens is you get the Protestant Reformation, but specifically in Catholicism, you get what's called the Counter-Reformation, right? Which is this kind of push against the Protestant Reformation. And one of the things that the church officials very clearly recognize is that their priests suck. To put it lightly, a lot of them do not speak Latin. A lot of them cannot perform the rites properly. A lot of them essentially bought their office as priest, to give them something to do. Sometimes, it's the second son that isn't going to inherit the property, who ends up buying himself the title of priest and then maybe bishop of a particular region and has no formal theological training, but is in charge of some geographic area. And so basically, This is where what the modern seminary system, seminaries are like universities for clergy. Um, the seminary system sort of emerges, right? The Counter-Reformation is like, we got to do, and this, comes out of the Council of Trent, and the documents from the Council of Trent, not the podcast currently on YouTube, also called the Council of Trent, hilariously, with Trent Horn. But the actual Council of Trent, where basically they're like, okay, they form the modern, what will become the modern form of the seminary system, so they can train priests in Latin and the proper kind of administration of church stuff. Yeah, Maya.
If they were practicing like pagan worship individually, though, aren't they still technically religious, even if they aren't Christian?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not that they don't have any spiritual beliefs. Right? They wouldn't be secular in the way that you would think of a secular atheist or agnostic. But this idea of like the profound Christianization of Europe, he thinks is incorrect.
But if he's saying that Europe was never as religious as we think it was, they're still religious, it's just not Christian religion.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit, because there's like subjective religiosity versus like those objective forms of religiosity, which is like, going to church or religious services all the time, participated in kind of a formal religious system. That, he says, was never as established as we think it was, right? It's not like on Sunday morning in the medieval village, everyone was in church. That's not to say that there was no kind of religious practices, just that sense that we have that, okay, well, now we can say Europe is so secular because no one goes to church in Europe. Well, he's like, well, no one went to church in Europe before, right? So there's not a profound difference between the medieval and the modern.
But nobody's, or not nobody, but like
what?
There's less like spiritual worship of pagan gods now.
Yeah, but that may have shifted then into something of a more kind of, it's a good point, more of a kind of amorphous, almost new agey kind of spirituality. We'll talk about that, especially when we talk about Iceland. He does address this. It's just coming a little later. You're getting ahead of the game. But no, they're really good questions. And we can come back to them. If you don't find his answers satisfactory, I'll see if I can conjure his spirit and to defend him. He probably would. He's such a bastard that I'm sure he would come back from beyond the grave just to argue with an undergraduate student. I think Stark is that kind of guy. I love him. He's like the honey badger of sociologists of religion, and he always puts a smile on my face with his curmudgeonly hate of everything, which resonates with me for some reason. An extensive survey of surviving parish churches in various parts of Europe, by Brooke and Brooke, in 1984, reveals them to be too small to have held more than a tiny fraction of local inhabitants. Okay, so what does this mean, right? The churches, like we have, sort of existing churches that have been sitting there since the Middle Ages, right? All across England, we have these, in various parts of kind of continental Europe, we have these churches. And basically, we have a pretty good sense of what the population of these places was, because towns and cities kept sort of basic records on population, and we could reconstruct a lot of this. And what Brooke and Brooke said is basically that most medieval churches were too small for, all but a tiny fraction of people in those communities to actually attend religious services, which suggests that, the amount of people going was significantly smaller than the total population of those villages. We know this from church records that many parishes in Europe had no priest or pastor, or if they were assigned one, they didn't know where this person was, right? They were absentee. Because, again, people were buying these as forms of patronage, right? They weren't really interested in being a priest. They were looking for a source of income for their second son. So they bought them the appointment as a parish priest, or their third son or fourth son, right? Because in the Middle Ages, only son number one inherited the estate of their father, and everybody else had to figure out something else to do. So they bought appointments to the clergy in medieval Europe, right? And a lot of these people had very little interest in being a priest, so they didn't show up, and there weren't enough of them. So many churches actually had no priest appointed to them for long periods, sometimes decades at a time. And yeah, even when people did go to church, they often did so unwillingly or behaved inappropriately while there. Oh, hang on. I will say, I wasn't sure if I had the quote on there. But basically he says, right, that medieval pastors, in their kind of records complained about the boorish behavior of people who came, right? People brought their dogs into church. They would sit in the pews and sleep. They would, fart and make noises and chat with other people while the person was trying to give a sermon. So you have a lot of letters from frustrated priests that actually were there saying, look, no one's listening. What is the point of doing this, right? And people would get frustrated with this, obviously for really kind of understandable reasons, right? So you have lots of this in kind of, and we have so many surviving records from the medieval period. We see a lot of these kind of correspondences going on, right? So we have this really strong sense. Okay, so the Renaissance, right? We get closer to modernity with the Renaissance. And basically, what we know from this, and the church starts keeping more records, we get beyond the Council of Trent, and the church gets more concerned with keeping better and better records and figuring out what's going on and tracking things, right? Because now there's competition in the market. So we have better data for this period. And, what we do know is pretty dismal in terms of church attendance, right? So this report from Peter Laslett, reporting on a particular English village where only 125 of 400 adults took communion, basically took Easter communion in the late 18th century, and went on to note much smaller attendance in other villages. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Why is it important? Why would it be important, especially Easter communion? So in Roman Catholicism, right, you really only have to take communion once a year, right? So while it's offered every day, theoretically, like there's a daily mass, and you can take communion every single day, your kind of obligation as a Roman Catholic is to confess your sins and take communion at least once a year, and you're supposed to do this at Easter, sometimes referred to as your Easter duty or Easter communion, right? So this would be a kind of marker of how well Christianized people are, how faithful they are, because even, the kind of, shall we say, squishier kind of Catholics would probably be doing, if they're faithful at all, would be doing their sort of Easter duty, right? They would be going to church, saying confession once a year, and getting that, communion once a year. And basically, less than half in this particular Easter village, was the bunny and all the chickens. My brain is scrambled on Monday mornings, not like Friday at all, where I was also scrambled. English village, right? So, the historical evidence we have of surveys that were done and people going around, saying basically not great attendance, right, in the 1700s, right, in the 18th century. And one of the really provocative claims, so this happens, before the great revivals sort of start in the 1800s, in the 19th century. Basically, Stark says that church membership in the UK in 2000, in terms of people who actually attended a parish, right, was higher in 2000 than it was at the turn of the 19th century in 1800. So, what ends up happening, and this again is kind of key to his case, is that once Europe enters modernity, it actually becomes more religious, and in this case, more Christian than it was during the medieval period in terms of attendance and people actually belonging to these particular parishes. What was the average for the exam? I think it was about 82. So it's on the high side, but it's pretty consistent with where it was last year, to be honest. I should probably be meaner to you and not tell you exactly what's going to be on the exam. I'll just be like, you'll be like, what's on the exam? And I'm like, nothing. And everything. And then just watch the panic settle into your souls and not just be like, think of examples in advance. No, I won't do that, but it always evens out. People are like, I did great on the first one, and they're like, I won't even study. And then the second midterm comes and it's like, I did real bad on that one. It all works itself out. Usually. Or I get in trouble. One or the other. You're like, you can get in trouble. That's okay. We'd rather get high grades. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? Okay, so yeah, basically Stark thinks that in the past, Europe wasn't as religious as we have been led to believe, specifically by the propaganda that comes out of the Enlightenment, right? So, the Enlightenment, right? Again, this period that starts, in the 18th century, with thinkers, especially anti-religious thinkers, guys like Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, right? All who kind of cast this period that we get in the 18th century as a period where, after 1,000 years of religious darkness in Europe, the lights go on, right? And suddenly reason returns to the continent. Now, I mean, the sort of myth of the Enlightenment that it created with its own sort of propaganda has been thoroughly debunked by historians, right? Medieval Europe had a lot of things going on in terms of learning, technological innovation, philosophy. It wasn't the Dark Ages in any reasonable sense of the word. But a lot of, the Enlightenment, you can say something about it as a historical and cultural movement, was so damn successful that we continue to believe a lot of the myths of the Enlightenment and the propaganda that Enlightenment thinkers sort of spouted, right? That this was a great age of enlightenment and that finally, they were Europe was so religious before, and only when we arrived on the scene in the Enlightenment did we cast out that religious ignorance and bigotry and all of that stuff. Again, I mean, a book, if you're interested in this kind of the history here, another book by Rodney Stark. I'm sorry, I'm apparently trying to fund his estate by recommending his books all the time. I swear to God, I'm not related to him. He wrote a really interesting book called How the West Won, where he kind of outlines, what was going on in the Middle Ages and how it led to modernity more so than the Enlightenment did. But that's neither here nor there in this case, right? But we have this myth, right, that Europe in the past was really quite religious. Everybody was super devout. And so, there's this perception then, and again, I think that's cast from the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment said, look, everybody was so religious and it was an age of ignorance, and now we're so enlightened and we're getting rid of religion, and that's the difference, right? So we have this perception that, people were drastically, or something changed drastically, and secularization has taken place broadly. Okay, and this is not, I say it's an Enlightenment kind of myth. It's a myth that has obviously some considerable reasoning behind it, right? Like if you go to Europe, right, the great cathedrals of Europe are certainly a testament to the fact that there was some religiosity in Europe, right? It wasn't for nothing that people built St. Peter's in Rome, Notre Dame in Paris, the Chartres Cathedral, or any, Cologne Cathedral. The one in Madrid that's still being built, I think was started quite a bit later. But anyway, right, there are these great cathedrals, these great religious monuments all across Europe. So it's not like there was no religion. That's certainly not the case that Stark is making. But this idea that the whole continent was deeply Christianized, he thinks is false. He thinks to some extent the nobility were, right? The upper classes, which is where you get these great monuments. But for the average people, right, actually, they were much more weakly Christianized than we tend to think, right? And this quote from Andrew Greeley, Greeley and Stark were friends. Greeley was a professor at University of Chicago. He was a Jesuit priest, right? So he was a Catholic priest from the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus. And, he was a very famous sociologist as well, because he was part of NORC, the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago. So, a decent, not just a priest, but a decent sociologist in his own right. This quote, there could be no de-Christianization of Europe because there was never any Christianization in the first place. Christian Europe never existed. Okay, so, yeah, please.
Sorry, so
historians debunked the whole that before the Enlightenment that there was no like civility or modernity?
No. So before the Enlightenment, like that basically the Middle Ages, which the Enlightenment thinkers referred to lovingly as the Dark Ages, and you maybe still hear that kind of kicked around. That they're basically like, so the Enlightenment myth is as follows. Let me just lay it out for you. Is that, basically Roman and Greek society, Greek and Roman society, right, were these very enlightened places with profound kind of, philosophy and all sorts of important things, right? People learned stuff. They were these very advanced societies. And then, what is the Edward Gibbons, how does he put it? And then the gray breath of the Galilee or of the Nazarene blew across them, right? So I love this metaphor from Gibbons. It's so apropos of the Enlightenment. The gray breath of the Nazarene. So like Christian thought, right, from the Nazarene being Jesus, obviously, because Jesus of Nazareth, right? The gray breath of the Nazarene blew across Europe, and all of that classical culture and Enlightenment that happened in the Greco-Roman period went dark for 1,000 years, right? And basically, the Middle Ages were this time of great ignorance. There was no philosophy going on. Architecture basically ceased to exist and doesn't get revived until the Renaissance, when they start imitating the Greco-Roman style again. And so the Middle Ages are this period for the Enlightenment thinkers where rationality and reason disappear, and Europe is cast into 1,000 years of darkness. Now this, and I do see your question, this is a myth, right? It doesn't take much digging into medieval history to see that there was a great deal going on in the Middle Ages. In terms of architecture, the medievals vastly surpassed the Romans in terms of their architecture, right? Things like the flying buttress were created that were far superior to Roman arches that allowed things like walls to become incredibly thin, allowed you to create, therefore you could put like beautiful stained glass in them. So they far surpassed in terms of both like philosophy, architecture, technology, anything the Greco-Romans had sort of created. And by the time you come out of the Middle Ages, Europe is, which went in at the end of the Greco-Roman period behind places like India and China in terms of technology, comes out of the Middle Ages far ahead, in terms of all sorts of technological kind of systems, right? By the, before the end of the Middle Ages, Europeans have the ability to basically sail across oceans, which is something that basically no other civilization can. Well, I mean, arguably the Chinese can, but they have no interest in doing it for a bunch of cultural reasons. But, Europe is far ahead technologically from the rest of the world, which would be weird if they fell into darkness for 1,000 years. And this is what Stark is saying, right? That this is broadly a myth that was created by the Enlightenment, because they wanted to be like, we're the enlightened ones and we're getting rid of religious darkness. Yeah, please.
You even argue that we even had a microcosm of that with the idea of modern and postmodern, even though postmodern is still technically modern. But they were like, no, we're different, but it's like you're still building off of all the things.
I think that's right, but I think this is why eventually people, I think responsible people have stopped using the term postmodern, right? And this is why, like, I don't really use it. I use late modernity instead of postmodernity, because what we're in now, whatever comes after modernity, I have no idea what it will be, but it probably won't be called postmodernity. And I think we're still in modernity because we're still kind of shaped by its ideology, especially this Enlightenment ideology of like, apply your reason, apply science, and we'll eventually create utopia or, whatever. Does that make sense though? And did I answer your question as well? Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, I probably answered it in much longer form than you needed. I've become derailed. What was I talking about? I mean, I could talk about Enlightenment myths for like weeks at a time. I think it's a really interesting historical question. Not the point of this class, but if anyone ever uses the word Dark Ages, you have my permission to slap them. Now, when you get arrested for assault, I will not help you, but you have my permission to do so and be like, there were no Dark Ages. Anyway, I have no idea what I was talking about. Right? Okay, Stark. Namaste. And namasko. Okay, so the Roman Empire. Okay, so what happens, right, in kind of the 4th century, right? So around the year 315, there's a Roman, so Rome was in a constant state of civil war, right? And basically, like, Julius Caesar, just before the turn, the turn from BC to AD, basically makes himself emperor of Rome. He gets killed, and then, his stepson Octavian, and then Mark Antony, one of his generals, and Pliny the Younger, basically fight it out to figure out who's going to be the emperor of Rome. And from then on, basically, you have brief periods of peace. Octavian becomes Augustus. But most of the time, the Roman Empire is caught up in a bunch of civil wars where everybody is fighting to be emperor. And around the year 300, 315, this is what's happening in the Roman Empire. And you get this cat named Constantine. And Constantine is one of 3 people kind of vying for the purple, right, for the role of emperor in the Roman Empire. And what happens is, before a very famous battle, so it's called the Battle for the Milvian Bridge, or the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine's forces, which are outnumbered about 2-1, basically are going to fight against one of the other 2, I can't remember which one now, Maximilian maybe, of the other kind of people who are vying to control the Roman Empire. And Constantine, the night before this battle, has a dream, right? And basically, he has this dream that, the Christian God comes to him and says, paint these Christian symbols on your shields, and I will grant you victory. And Constantine and his much smaller army are victorious at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And eventually Constantine slays his 2 rivals and becomes emperor of the Roman Empire. Now, for a while, Constantine has kind of, he makes Christianity an official religion of the Roman Empire, which it had been a non-permitted religion, even though good evidence that it was growing really quickly. And then, slightly later on, and I forget the exact year, Constantine converts to Christianity, right? And he, on his deathbed, Constantine gets baptized and converts to Christianity. There's a bunch of reasons to think that this probably makes sense based on the theology of the time, right? It was thought that baptism would wipe away all of your sins. And so a nasty guy like Constantine, who's constantly having his rivals murdered, probably wants to wait on the whole getting your sins forgiven thing as late as possible in the process, because, if he gets baptized too early, he's going to go and commit a whole bunch of other sins and probably end up in hell, right? This is the nature of being a Roman emperor. So he converts to Christianity, and this has long been held to be the reason that then Europe gets Christianized, right? The Roman Empire dominates Europe. The Roman Empire becomes officially Christian, and therefore, Europe got Christianized because of Constantine. But Stark will make, and I do see your question. I'm just on a roll here. But Stark contends that actually what happened is that this official kind of Christianization that happened through Constantine more or less either slowed or at least put the brakes on Christianization in Europe. Yeah, please. Sorry,
It was Battle of what?
The Milvian Bridge. So Milvian, if I recall the spelling. Okay, so why? Why does Stark think? So basically, and we'll see this when we talk about the rise of Christianity, I think there's pretty good historical evidence that Christianity had been growing at a pretty fast clip in the Roman Empire, right? So that by about the year 300, 325, roughly half the population of the Roman Empire had become Christian, right? And this was a religion that was officially prohibited for a bunch of reasons, right? They wouldn't pay, because they're basically, Jewish in a lot of ways, they wouldn't pay homage to the emperor as a god, because there's only one god in Christianity, theoretically. So it wasn't officially allowed, right? And yet, probably, by the mid-200s, you're probably talking about somewhere in the range of about 10% of the empire being Christianized. Sorry, I may be getting the dates wrong a little bit. By about 300, you have about 10% of the empire being Christianized. By 350, it's about half, right? But this was an organic process happening without official state support, right? And this is a group having gone from maybe 150 followers in 33 AD, to then, half the Roman Empire, or maybe about 30 million people by the year kind of 350, maybe at the latest. So what Stark says is this was a highly dynamic, energetic religious movement that was having tremendous success, basically spreading its message and converting people, and that this basically more or less stops when Constantine makes it the official religion. Why? Well, it all goes back to this idea of religious markets, right? And so, if you recall sort of what Stark and Ainacone said, is that when you get a religious monopoly, right, and you have one religion that is the one supported by the state, religions tend to get quite lethargic, right? And a lot of that energy that went into attracting new people in order to financially support yourself and increase your influence, once you have total influence, you get really, really lazy, right? So, and especially the clergy got really, really lazy, according to Stark. I know a lot of priests. I don't necessarily disagree. I don't like them. This is probably the problem. I will not say nice things about them, generally. Okay, so Christianity got lazy, right? So this highly energetic kind of religious movement that had been growing since 33, from 33 and for 3 centuries had basically been growing, got kind of lazy. Why? Well, suddenly, the priests and the bishops were all state supported, right? So suddenly they're getting their paycheck or sack of money, in this case, from the state, right? From the Roman emperor himself. And then later, the feudal lords that take over the kingdoms that break apart from from the dissolution of the Roman Empire in the late 5th century. Okay, so it got really lazy about evangelizing, and instead of, converting ordinary people, which it looks like it had great success in doing in the early days. And again, we'll talk about this with the rise of Christianity. It's a fascinating story of how Christianity expanded so quickly, and very counterintuitive in lots of ways. So it was expanding by converting masses, and then when it becomes the official state religion, it sort of shifts to converting kingdoms, right? So it's like, we want this kingdom to become Christian, so you convert the nobility, right? But outside of the nobility, it often remains kind of light and shallow. And one of the best examples that Stark points to is Scandinavia. I'll say Scandinavia was one of the last places in Europe to be Christianized. Yeah, please.
Sorry, so they wanted to get the royals to convert, so they were still following Greek and Roman gods?
Well, in different places, like if you went into Germany, right, they would have been following the local pagan German gods. They would have had their own gods. But, so this is kind of how it works, right? So if we take the example of, say, the Rus, right? So the Kievan Rus, centered in Kiev around the year 988. You have, Prince Vladimir of Kiev. And basically, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev converts, we say that the Rus was converted, right? Now, the Slavs had their own kind of Slavic gods and this whole kind of Slavic mythology. And none of that really goes away for a long time. Even you see elements of it still in Slavic folklore. Figures like Baba Yaga are still in Slavic folklore. But what happens is they converted Prince Vladimir. And it's like, we got the king of basically the Russians. So now the Russians are Christian. Yay, we've won. And not a lot of work went in afterwards to actually Christianizing the peasants, right? The people kind of in the countryside. It's like, because I converted the king, now everyone in his kingdom is Christian. Yay, we won. And that was, does that make sense? Okay. You didn't have all right. You were scratching. Okay. All good. So Scandinavia is a good example of this as well, right? Basically, Scandinavia, so Sweden, Finland, Norway are the last kind of, Western European places to be kind of Christianized. And what happens there right, basically is missionaries come in, they convert the nobility builds some fancy churches, right? Stockholm is peppered with really cool churches. I've never been to Oslo, I assume it's the same. But what Stark says is that Christianization is very skin deep. So, I think it's around the 800s or 900s when Scandinavia is sort of Christianized. And when you get to basically the beginning of the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation, what happens is because they don't want to be under the sway of Rome, right? They don't want to pay money to the Pope, and they want to set their own kind of policies. The Swedes convert to Lutheranism, right? So they become officially Lutheran. And what Stark says is, as opposed to some other places that had been more deeply Christianized, where there's a ton of kind of conflict between Protestants and Catholics, the people of Sweden sort of shrug their shoulders and say, okay, I guess we're all Lutherans now. I didn't care that much in the first place, so I don't care that much about this conversion either, right? Nobody really cared. It was like they went from officially Catholic to officially Protestant, and it was sort of a shrug, right? England, which had been much more deeply Christianized, right? You get religious warfare in England, right? Between, the Protestants and the Catholics. Obviously, Germany gets split between Lutheran and Catholic as well. So you get, I'm trying to remember I would say Bavaria, which is principally Catholic, and Prussia, which is principally Protestant, right? And won't become unified for several centuries after that. So, places that have been more deeply Christianized, it takes longer to fight it out. But we see a kind of shallow Christianization in a lot of places where we see the nobility, kind of being like, we don't want to be Catholic no more. Let's be Protestant so we don't have to pay the Pope. And it kind of goes over easy. Yeah, please.
So when you're talking about conflict, are you talking about conflict mainly among the nobles and not like everyday people?
Well, okay, so I've tripped on a historical landmine and blown up my foot, metaphorically. So here's the story, and I think, again, the kind of common history we have is that, Europe was split in a bunch of religious warfare, through the 17th century, especially. You get the 100 Years' War. This is somewhat true and it somewhat isn't, right? A lot of it, and I think David Bentley Hart makes this case really well. I dropped that thing and I'm not picking it up. In a book called, I can't remember which one it is. I want to say it's called Atheist Delusions, but I can't remember now. That basically these are the wars of the nascent kind of nation states, right? And as they're trying to split off from kind of empires and the control particularly of Rome, they forge a bunch of alliances. And sometimes it's, if you look at some of the wars that took place, it's like Catholics and Protestants in France go fight these people because they want this German land. And then as soon as that alliance breaks down, things shift around. We think of them as wars of religion, but they're really wars of the nascent nation states. And the nobles kind of used religion as a banner to be like, yeah, Catholicism, but also we're allied with these Protestants. But hey, let's go take that German land, right? So it's a complicated part of history. We've simplified it because we do that all the time to be like, these were wars of religion, right? We talk about the 100 Years' War. And such things. But, it was probably less about Christianity and more about political power than anything else. Okay, I don't even know. I'm like, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Oh my God, I got nothing done today. It's a really interesting, we should just talk about this piece for the rest of the term. Okay, so this is kind of Stark's quote, right? Contrary to the received wisdom, the conversion of Constantine did not cause the triumph of Christianity. And this is such a provocative claim, and this is historical revisionism, right? Where basically he's looking at historical facts and turning them on its head. And this is what Stark is so good at, is making you wonder about whether what you've received from history or the popular version of history that you think you know is correct, right? Contrary to the received wisdom, the conversion of Constantine did not cause the triumph of Christianity. Rather, it was the first and most significant step in slowing its progress, draining its vigor, right? Because after that, the priesthood got so lazy, and distorting its moral vision, right? One of the things that he makes the case of is that Christianity goes from this movement that's very much focused on the poor and meek. Again, we'll see it in the rise of Christianity in really interesting ways. to one that is, that becomes allied with state power, right? In ways that obviously, I think are recognizable to us, right? The church has become linked with state power, and it distorts the moral vision of Christianity, away from this like care for the poor, the weak, and all that stuff, to, one where it's in service of the state in lots of ways. Most of the evils associated with European Christianity since the middle of the 4th century can be traced to its establishment, right, and its alliance with the state. And I mean, like at the very kind of fairly contemporary level, you can think of residential schools in Canada, right, as being linked with establishment, like the establishment of kind of Catholicism, and then Christianity in general as religions that were supported by the state. Ends up, these churches cooperate with the state in major ways, and that leads to all sorts of evils, right? Including things like residential schools in Canada. Okay. Oh, could it be that people were forced to attend churches in medieval Europe due to stratified hierarchies instead of their own will? I'm going to go with yes, probably. Yeah, I mean, I think whether people wanted to, it became the official religion, so people, sort of joined in. Is Lutheran and Protestant the same thing? What is Constantine? Roman emperor. We'll go with that. Why is Constantine is a different story. All right. Hang on. Let's see if I can find. I'll see if it's. I don't know how long it is. I mean, I have to. Oh, my computer has now. I'll have to explain Protestantism to you. I know you can't see. I'm aware. I'm just trying to find a particular video. Oh, it's 5 minutes long. Okay, next time I will start with the Reformer Piggybackers or the Protestant song. It'll be great, I promise. We'll leave it there for today, and I'll answer what are Lutherans and Protestants the same. It's not as obvious as you think. We'll start with the Protestant song on Wednesday.
It is October 31st, and I have got